Dave, I want to ask you about the golden age, what I would consider the golden age when I look back upon it and just coming through, growing up in the 50s, and it's in the wake of World War II, and these guys are coming back, and they're working on these cars and designing and developing new things, and it's just an amazing period in our nation's history. When you go back to that period when you were working at these tracks and then started the television broadcast and all the crazy barnstorming that was going on, you're working with Steve Evans, another legendary broadcaster that helped bring drag racing into our living rooms. What was that like?
Well, it was the ultimate in the terms of the sport of drag racing in my mind. You hit on the phrase the golden years. I've always tried to live under the philosophy that the good old days are right now, that you got to have that attitude or you might get really depressed is the way I always looked at it. However, in retrospect, you have to take into consideration that the times were very conducive towards it. The import business into the United States in the terms of the influx of the foreign car influence was basically non-existent. And it was all centered around American cars. And as the natural competitive aspects came out in the individuals, they wanted their cars to go faster and quicker. And with that, that's what led to me, at least, to the incredibly rapid growth of the sport of drag racing. Oh, yeah, I mean, the facilities were nothing. Yeah, most of the time I worked in the early years in this sport from the late 50s up through, 65, 66 on racetracks that were converted off of old abandoned airports or in some cases active airports, that the guy had come over in an airplane and he'd buzz the field a couple of times. You'd shut down the racing, he'd land, taxi off, and you'd go back to racing again. That was commonplace in that era, at least where I was. Then became the driving force of, how about let's build a 4 drag racing facility. Well, that's what led to the eventual super tracks. In my mind, the very first super track was Dallas International Motor Speedway. I say that with some personal involvement because for a brief period of time I was vice president and general manager of it. But it was a fabulous facility, and now that's been far eclipsed by a number of other racetracks. But in that first era, it was the sport of drag racing, in my mind, gained the position of being the everyman's racing sport. No matter what your budget, no matter what your car, you could find a place to race in drag racing. You could find a place to be competitive. If you had the money, you ran a faster car. The old saying of how fast do you want to go, and the answer is how much money do you have to spend, is extremely true. I mean, there's been no question about that being the guiding rule in drag racing since I started in it. But it, unfortunately, has grown at the same pace as has basically the cost of everything else. So it was just that moment in time that I don't think will ever be repeated. I certainly enjoy the nostalgia events, and I'm actively involved, a board member for the NHRA Museum, and I do a lot of work for them and their reunions. And, yeah, it's a lot of fun, and it gives you at least a sampling of what it was like. But unless you were there, unless you grew up in it, you really don't understand what drag racing on a continuing basis was like in that era. And I liken it to the thought that you could go every week or every month to a racetrack and you basically would see something new. And it was there maybe as a trial. You maybe never ever saw it again. But that was one of the mystiques, if you will, of drag racing in that era. Unfortunately, the emphasis on winning has become so great that if somebody hits a combination that really works, nobody else has got the time or the money to try to develop something different. And as the speeds increase, the rules have changed and makes it even more difficult to do a lot of changes to things. So, as I say, you had to be there, but a reunion or a nostalgia event today gives you at least a sampling of what it was like in those days.
The visible innovation must have been so cool, as you described, showing up to tracks. And I got a taste of that in the 80s with the streamliners and such, and Amato
Right.
with the tall wing. I got to experience the tail end of that, and for my money, that was one of the most interesting and exciting aspects of it. Nowadays, you can't see the innovation. I know it's there, but it's more under the surface.
Yeah, I catch a lot of criticism from people about today's drag racing. Oh, there's never any changes. There's no innovation. And I says, yeah, there is. You just don't see it. And the reason you know the innovation is there is look at what has happened to the elapsed times and speeds. It's constantly gone straight up. No matter what rules, restrictions are placed on it, the length of the racetrack or whatever, the racer adapts to it and continues to improve. Well, you look at the thing, the car, and it looks just like it did 5 years ago in many respects. But trust me, something has happened inside what you're looking at to get it to be a state of continual improvement. So the innovation is there. It's just difficult to see it as evident as it was in those early days.
Dave, what was it like working with Wally Parks during that period? Drag racing is on equal footing with NASCAR and other major motorsports in the world, maybe even in advance of it. You guys are trying to grow the sport. There's racers all around the country, big personalities, guys like McClelland and Prudhomme and Garlitz and Muldowney that you guys can really talk about and hype up, and they're not afraid to go back and forth in the media. These were all things that were a huge advantage for you guys, and Wally is trying to navigate the ship of NHRA and grow it into what we know it as today. That must have been an incredible experience.
Well, it was. I had the good fortune of first meeting Wally when I announced Indy in 1961. And in a multitude of relationships, from employee to full-time employee to a contract worker to, in later years, a close personal friend, Wally was one of the more intriguing people I have ever known. I have never known anyone quite as dedicated to making something work as Wally was about drag racing. It was sometimes a real challenge for an individual that was trying to do publicity and PR, because Wally was single-minded in so many ways that he drag racing overshadowed all in his mind. And with that, you couldn't really come up with any kind of situation where it may not be the number one thing, because Wally always said, that's what I want to do. I want to make it into something really big. And he, I think, probably was a bit astonished at what all of his efforts accomplished. He constantly said, I never had any idea it would do this. And I thought, well, I guess that is a tribute not only to him and his efforts, but a lot of people that were involved over the years to make the sport grow into what it is. And it has certainly changed in so many aspects, but it is still as an intriguing and exciting motorsports venue that you could find. I continue to feel that it is the single motorsport that appeals to all sorts of people, regardless of your car and regardless of your budget. And yes, you may not be running in the big show, but you're out there competing, and that's what it's all about, one-on-one against each other.
Totally agree on that, and that's how I have been fortunate enough to be involved on the bracket race level at my local track. That's how I got started. That's how I got my initial announcing gig, by going out there and running my street car with 0 modifications. And, of course, it has turned into this for me, so I know it's turning into a lot of things for other people out there. Now, Dave, we just had the 60th anniversary of the NHRA, and I think NHRA really pulled out all the stops to get the legends out there and really cherish its roots with Muldowney and Garlitz and just across the board legends at all the big races. What did you think of the 60th season?
I was quite impressed. I thought they did an outstanding job overall in capsulizing 60 years of history. I was very fortunate to be invited by ESPN to do the voiceover on all of their historical vignettes for the entire season. And if you talk about bringing back some fond memories, that one certainly hit the bill with this old man, because these were events and people that I grew up with. These were my best friends for 40-some-odd years, and they still are. It's just I don't get a chance to see them very often. But to have that opportunity to relive it over the 60 years of NHRA is incredible, and I commend them on putting forth the effort to do it. Obviously, they are concentrating on making it successful today, but at least for the 60th year, they gave just credit to the history of the sport.
I thought you did a great job on those vignettes as well. I was fortunate enough to be standing right below the stage when they determined the number one moment of all time in the NHRA between Garlitz and Force. Garlitz with the rear-engine dragster and Force coming back for his championship.
Right.
And your voice boomed over the loudspeaker once again. What did you think about John winning that?
Well, back when they had who is the number one driver competition, and that's been several years ago, I was fortunate enough to be on the voting committee that voted on that. And I sent the initial ballot back with John and Don both number one. And my philosophy and thinking was that if you separate the sport of drag racing into eras, which it can easily be done, we've been talking so much here about the golden era. Well, that was yesterday, and today is today. And I thought that Don Garlitz certainly deserved to be number one through that whole golden era period. But John Force picked up where Don Garlitz started to taper off after his career began slowing down, and went ahead full speed. So I felt that John deserved the number one for the last 15 years of competition. Well, the organizers, National Dragster, sent it back and says you can only have number one. So I voted for Garlitz because he, throughout the period of time when exposure wasn't quite as good or anything else, always kept the drag racing out in the forefront through various media efforts and things such as that. It's a changing time. As I say, those of us who remember and lived through that era are getting in fewer in number by every year. I have the distinction of being the master of ceremonies for the events at the reunion, and we have made it a practice that we have a memorial tribute to those who have passed away in the year that has transpired since the previous reading of the list of people that passed away. And I can tell you there's a whole lot of friends that I have had over the years that are now included on that list. So you got to understand that the base of the audience is changing. The face of it is, because those of us that participated in that era are slowly but surely, unfortunately, passing on. So I can see why they would move towards the John Force being the number one story